during the pandemic, I mentioned that we all really relearned the importance of nature to our health and well-being, but that nature is in crisis and it's putting human as well as planetary health at risk. The World Economic Forum has declared that this decade has to be a turning point where we recognise the value of nature, but also place it on a path to recovery so that our world is one where people, economies and nature can all thrive. And you will have seen on Saturday the UN members agreed a unified treaty to protect biodiversity in the high seas, which is nearly half of the planet's surface. And it concludes weeks of talks in New York. But the Accenture UN CEO study found that biodiversity is very low on the private sector agenda, and the consequences of that could be drastic. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this next conversation. It's between award-winning science communicator and author, Dr. Claire O'Connell, and the President of University College Cork, Professor John O'Halloran.
Happy International Women's Day. John, it is so good to be sat here with you, President of University College Cork. Just an interesting aside, backstage we were chatting and it turned out that John went to school across the road from my grandmother's house where my mum grew up. So sometimes it can feel like a very small world. But despite that, we're facing a big problem, John, aren't we, in nature? And it's a massive crisis. And I suppose I want to focus this morning on biodiversity, its value, and the lessons that we can learn from it. Some of the stats are kind of scary. Even this morning, we saw the Plant Atlas 2020 talking about the decline in native Irish species and native species in Britain. And that's precipitated by changes in land use. Increasingly, we're seeing biodiversity loss driven by climate change. And a statistic that really kind of put everything into perspective for me was from the World Wildlife Fund. And they found that between 1971 and 2018, or 1970, sorry, I was born in 71, so I'm thinking this is kind of my lifetime, 70% of wild animal populations just declined globally. So, John, you are, as well as being president of UCC, you are a researcher who has done a lot of work on the ecology of birds, forests, insects. So from your perspective, can you paint us a picture of what's going on with biodiversity?
Before I do so, it's lovely. Can I wish every woman in the audience happy International Women's Day? I have 5 sisters and a wonderful wife and a daughter. And for me as an ecologist, I was inspired by a woman called Maura Mulcahy, who was the first woman professor, I think, in UCC. She was certainly the first woman vice president. So for me, my entire life, I've enjoyed extraordinary inspiration from women.
She was a zoologist, doesn't she?
She's a professor of zoology, an extraordinary woman. To answer your question, maybe we'll define biodiversity first. So I suppose biodiversity is all the elements of collective animals and plants and insects and bugs and fungi, all the kinds of things that make the world work. And we kind of look at groups of species then, like plants or animals, because we can see them. And I think over COVID, we probably came a bit more connected with nature. We were locked down into areas of maybe 2 kilometers and less, and we started to connect more with nature. So our understanding of the biodiversity itself, so biodiversity is all that collection, and then of course there are species within that. And what we've seen, as you quite rightly said, is significant declines in some of these species. Now, one of the central axioms in biodiversity and ecology, and I think it's relevant to today, is diversity begets stability. And I think it's one message I'd like to go out today, is that diversity in every shape and form. That's how ecosystems function. That's how plants and animals interact, how we fix carbon. We hear a lot about carbon. So biodiversity provides the food supply, the things we eat. It provides structure. It provides all the carbon that we eat, but also creates a wonderful place where we can connect with each other and with nature.
And so, John, I mean, it strikes me that just at a time that scientists, as biologists, were beginning to figure out the vast complexity of interconnected ecosystems, and the beauty within that diversity, and the kinds of lessons we can learn from it, the kinds of adaptations, as you say, that sort of diversity begets stability because the ecosystem is not putting all its eggs in one basket, quite literally. It's that if a disease comes and hits some aspect, there's another species that can sort of, move in there or whatever. It's very dynamic. So what do we lose when we lose biodiversity? Because at the moment, we are living through a mass extinction event.
Yeah, we've lost potentially about 1 million species, and that's of the species we know. I mean, you might be surprised, there are a lot of species we don't know in the deep seas and other parts of the world. So we've lost an extraordinary amount, and you're quite right, we're going through one of the most rapid declines in species in all our generations. So that's quite an extraordinary responsibility for some of us who've been on the planet that length of time. So what we've got to try and do is to see, first of all, understand what the species is, and then secondly, what their role and function is. So we call it a functional system. So one of the simplest examples might be pollinators. So bees, we know that hopefully people know what a bee is. They might have got stung by a bee, but bees function, and all pollinators is to pollinate plants to produce fruit. So if we, in a more simple, practical sense, that if you remove bees, then you won't have plants. And I had a stark moment where I have a PhD student that was working with me looking at landscapes across China. And I had never been there. I have been there many times since. But I said to him, why don't you look at pollinators? And he said, there are none. So all of their crops are GMO'd. So that's what happens. We can use the technologies, but there's natural systems that enable pollinations to happen. And in Ireland, we have about almost 100 species, and 60% of those species are at risk.
Right.
So that's the scale, and similarly, I work a lot on birds, and birds, there's a significant number of species that are at risk also in the case of birds.
And so when we lose these things, when we come in and maybe sort of, grow things in a certain way, cultivate things in a certain way, and that destroys the biodiversity, we're sort of brushing aside things that have taken millions of years to co-evolve, aren't we? And come in with possibly a short-term thinking, and that has long-term consequences. Let's think about why it's important to keep biodiversity, not only for products and services, but also for the lessons it can teach us. Why is it important to have diversity, both in nature and in business in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most practical sense is an astonishing figure. The value of biodiversity ecosystem service is $44 trillion. $44 trillion. That's 50%.
That's a lot of zeros.
That's 50% of global GDP. So imagine if we took out all the plants and animals. Hopefully that will never happen. And if it did, we wouldn't survive very long. But that's the scale of the economic impact. But I think all of us, over the last number of years, have found much more deeper connection with nature, which for that reflective space. And we have done research at UCC now, one of my colleagues in psychology, to look at the impact of nature on one's mental health and well-being. And we know it is really important. Hopefully people have connected more with nature and engaged more with nature and listening to birdsong or viewing beautiful plants. And there's extraordinary talent that we can do that, but also the idea that we can become more reflective and enjoy ourselves more, and also help our mental health and well-being.
So this was Dr. Annalisa Setti,
Annalisa Setti, yeah, she's a wonderful colleague, yeah. And so we have this wonderful green campus, and we, as many of our universities have, and we use the green space for both for teaching, but also for reflection space, and indeed for the community. And I think that was really important that we don't forget that connectedness with nature that we've all learned perhaps over the last 2 years.
And she was able to measure the impact on the well-being and the mental health. Yeah.
And what she called the chaotic family. So when you come out from a chaotic family, certainly chaotic in my house anyway at times, but when you go out and you go into that sense of place and space, you get a different type of reflection, which certainly helps you on your thought process, but also your mental health.
What kind of things can we learn about leadership from nature and biodiversity?
Yeah, we've just launched a strategic plan in University College Cork, and one of the things I've chose to do as a leader to describe the importance of leadership across the organisation is I use murmurations of starlings. And some of you may know these large murmurations of starlings, which are extraordinary big flocks. You see them on television, and you've seen them, perhaps you've seen them yourself. And the idea here is that each starling is an individual, but they can be a leader and follower at the same time. So that idea, it's certainly in a university where you can see and give people opportunity to lead, but also to follow. There's a second part of it, which is, and you're a plant scientist, you'll probably understand this more than I, but we know that birds see in the UV spectrum. So we don't see in UV, but birds do. So when a starling looks at another starling, they look completely different from you and I. Yeah. And I think there's an important metaphor there, because like it or not, we all judge people when we meet them. And sometimes when we look a bit deeper and closer at those persons, we find an extraordinary richness. So for me, there are wonderful examples in nature that we can take into leadership to enable us to try and make the workplace and our world a better place, to secure our future for our people and for our planet.
Brilliant. Just finally, to wrap up, I know Michelle referred to an Accenture UN study of CEOs there. And from that study, there was 2,500 CEOs worldwide, there was a very strong appetite for building resilience and nature positivity in business. So what's your advice to people in the room? What can we do today to protect biodiversity?
Yeah, so I think the first point, just coming back to diversity for a moment, resilience relies on diversity. So you don't have resilience in ecosystems unless you have diversity. So I would say to everybody, go outside, get connected, get engaged, and follow some of the actions, the small actions that might seem small to you, but will be extraordinarily impactful in protecting our biodiversity and our habitat loss.
So what we can do in our small world will have an impact
big
on the
impact,
big
yeah.
world.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. John O'Halloran, everybody.
Thank you very much. That's great. Well done.